those are my little thoughts. I'm so grateful that you have decided to give up some time and hopefully to receive something really powerful here together this weekend. As Katie said, my name is Catherine Ricketts. I'm new to Wayne Presbyterian. I became involved here last summer when my husband Austin was hired as the new youth minister. So some of you may have had the opportunity to meet him. And I'm just thrilled for the opportunity to get to know the women of WaynePres this weekend. Already, I've learned that the women of WaynePres know how to pray. I'm very impressed by the 20 minutes of silence that began our time together. It is very hard to sit in silence together for 20 minutes. So kudos to you for that. I learned that you can bake, and I learned that you can sing. I was sitting at the choir table, I think. And what a joyful noise. The title of our retreat is Grief, Joy, and the Heart of God. When I was 25, an older friend suggested to me that if we are really looking at what's happening within us and around us, we will always be grieving something, and we will always be celebrating something. There's no moment in our lives when the light of joy and the shadow of sorrow do not crumble together like shades cast by shivering leaves on the wall. It can be really hard to hold these two things in tension, grief and joy. Sometimes we only open ourselves up to the things that cheer us. We're frightened to really sit with the things that grieve us because we fear that to open ourselves to grief will paralyze us. It might slow us down at work or render us incapable of attending to the needs of those around us, small children, aging parents, sick spouses. So we put up walls, we check our phones, we stay busy, we pour a drink. We're desperate for a diversion from the suffering of others and the suffering within our own hearts. Or at other times, all we can think of is our grief. Maybe joy feels out of reach when death is near, or divorce, or other varieties of loss. We may bear an acute sense of our sorrow. Or maybe we carry a more generalized sense of despondence. Like, what right do we have to rejoice when over the past 2 years we have this constant awareness of suffering around us? And those things might make us blind to the small joys that attend us even in moments of loss. Or we may find that we are numb when big moments, milestones, celebrations come upon us, and they don't even really bring us joy the way that they might have in other seasons. As we will see during our time together this weekend, grief and joy reside together in the heart of God. God rejoices in the beauty and dignity of all that God has made. God laments everything in this world that goes against the way of love. And God is joyously raising creation into new and everlasting life in which God wipes the tears from every eye. When God's Son came to us in the person of Jesus, his entire life was marked by this simultaneity of joy and sorrow. Angels and wise men rejoiced at his birth with songs and with gifts of gold. Meanwhile, King Herod raged, and the mothers of Bethlehem wept as things were happening in the same season. The prophet Simeon sang a hymn of praise when the newborn Christ was presented at the temple. But in the same prayer, he foretold the child's death. He said to Mary, "A sword will pierce your own soul too." Even in rejoicing at the birth of this child, there was the shadow of death. Countless vignettes from Jesus' ministry express this simultaneity, and even Christ's resurrected body bears the scars of his cross. When we open ourselves to grief and joy at once, we are welcomed into the very heart of God. While we're together over the next 24 or so hours, I want to invite you to sit with grief and joy at once. We're going to meet as a large group like this 3 times, once tonight and twice tomorrow. Tonight, I will share some of my own story and invite you to reflect on your story and the things that you are grieving and celebrating right now. Tomorrow morning, we will explore in more depth biblical accounts from the life of Jesus and discuss how grief and joy are both present from Christ's birth through his resurrection. And we will also consider the depth of joy that comes on the other side of suffering. And then in our third session, we're going to consider how works of art can help us to contain or hold in the same hand these conflicting emotions. And then after all the times when we gather together in this room, tomorrow afternoon there will be 3 breakout group opportunities, just ways to deepen what we have learned together in our time as a big group. The 3 options will be a memoir writing workshop with me, a visual art, I think it's a watercolor workshop with a beautiful artist named Birdie Bush, and a yoga practice for those that want to respond more with their bodies. I think it can be really good after sitting and listening to things all day and feeling lots of feelings to just move. So that might be a really wonderful option for you. I hope that in our time together, your sorrows are soothed, your joy can find expression, and all of this in the loving embrace of our God. So let me start by telling you a bit about me. I am the daughter of a Presbyterian minister and a labor and delivery nurse who is joining us right here, my mother, Maureen. I've been married to Austin for 8 years, and together we have Torrance, who's almost 3, and Oliver, who is 9 months old. So we have a lot of cuteness and not a lot of sleep in our life right now. I've spent my career working between art institutions and work in Christian ministry or theology. My work in the arts has taken me to places like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the radio station WXPN, the Philadelphia Fringe Festival, a festival of theater and music, dance. So that has been, my career has been a lot of fun. And all the while I have been writing. I write about the arts, I write about Christian spirituality. I just, last week, signed a contract to write my first book. It will be called Mothers and Weepers, and it's about motherhood and artistic practice. And the other thing that I've written a lot about is our subject for tonight, grief and joy, and the way that these 2 things are at play in our lives. Much of my writing and my Christian faith has been shaped by 2 significant losses in my immediate family that took place within 2 years' time in my late 20s. And tonight I want to tell you that story. As I do, I want you to consider the questions: what are you celebrating right now? And what are you grieving right now? In 2012, my father was diagnosed with brain cancer, a form called glioblastoma. I had been living away from my family at the time of his diagnosis, and I moved back to Philly to a house a few blocks away from where my parents lived in West Philadelphia, so that I could participate with my mom and my brothers in caregiving. My 2 brothers, Joe and Chris, moved home as well, and together we drove Dad to and from chemotherapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy. Joe and Chris held him under the arms to help him recuperate his ability to walk after brain surgery. Joe cooked his meals. Chris and I sang to my dad. We helped him to get dressed. to use the bathroom, and finally to shift positions in the bed when he could no longer carry his own weight. In the midst of this intensive caregiving, I met Austin. I was performing music at a house concert in South Philly. We talked all night and we got drinks the next weekend. And immediately he struck me as wise and smart and deeply kind. His mother was sick with ovarian cancer, and there was a kinship in the way that we had come beside our parents in their time of need. After our first date, I took a train from Philly out to Chestnut Hill to see friends, and I cried like a baby the entire train ride. I was overcome with gratitude that a person like this would come into my life at the precipice of loss. Already, grief and joy were beginning to mingle. Our love grew quickly and easily. We met in December, and by February, we were talking about how we should be married to each other. And we began to wonder how to plan a wedding when my dad's health was so precarious. We met with our pastor, who had been bringing communion to my dad every week and really knew our family deeply. He understood the precariousness of our situation, that we hoped my dad would be present for the wedding, but we didn't know whether my dad would be present for the wedding. He said, listen, first you need to just get over the vision of a wedding that is like a week of mimosas with your girlfriends. It's not going to be like that. It will not be simple and simply joyful. Whether you get married before your dad dies or after your dad dies, it will happen in the shadow of that loss. But go ahead and plan the wedding that you want, and if we need to, I will shotgun this thing in your parents' living room, keep you on speed dial this summer. So on Friday night in June, my dad was released from the hospital to hospice, and the doctor said, if you want your dad to be at your wedding, you should get married this weekend. That afternoon, I bought a dress. That night, Austin officially proposed. And the next morning, my friends and my neighbors and my aunts and cousins came to my parents' house with cakes and once-used wedding veils and flowers, and then we were married in my parents' living room at sundown that night. With my dad looking on from his hospice bed and my mom sitting next to him. As we made our vows, my parents showed us how to keep them. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. My dad lived another month. It was late July when he died early one morning in that same bed. And in the wake of that loss, I remember my friend's words that if we are really tuned into what's happening within and around us at any given moment, we will always be grieving something and we will always be celebrating something. At our wedding, I was especially awake to this reality. Joy and sorrow were married in our room. Death was at our door, and yet joy abounded in the visual beauty of wildflowers and frosted cakes and wedding veils, and the moral beauty of promises kept unto death, of new promises being made, and of this vibrant community of people, my brothers, Joe and Chris, our cousins, aunts and uncles, and neighbors and friends that would see us through all of it. I sensed God's presence in every small joy. And the thing that gave me great joy, heavy as it was knowing that my dad was only moving further into God's presence. My dad had been a Presbyterian minister and believed heartily that in death he would be raised to new life and welcomed evermore into God's eternal love. And we knew that when we released him, we were releasing him into that mystery. Austin and I were just beginning to feel recovered from the intense start of our marriage when we experienced another loss. It's not uncommon for siblings raised in the same household to have opposite experiences of identical circumstances. And while I was celebrating my dad's life and my new marriage, my brother Joe began using heroin. This was after almost 2 decades of struggle with substance use disorder in his life. Over time, he had become an expert at hiding his use. And so while for much of my teens and 20s, I was very aware and very anxious about his drug use, by the end, I wasn't totally aware that he had been using. And so it came as a great surprise when 2 years after my dad died, one evening in June, Joe died of an overdose of heroin and fentanyl. He was 32. Many of you may have experienced losses like the loss of my dad, where there's a lot of beauty and celebration at the end of a life well lived. And some of you may have experienced loss where you just can't see joy in it. This was like that. I could not see beauty in this death. It felt not meaningful as my dad's death had felt, but senseless, absurd. My dad had lived a generous and joyful life. My brother's life seemed characterized by loneliness. My dad had lived with an assured faith in the resurrection. My brother was a confessed atheist who had softened into an agnostic by the time of his death. In the wake of loss, I didn't sense God's presence, but instead I wondered and aggravated over God's absence. I had prayed since I was a teenager that God would save my brother from addiction. Was this the best that he could do? That summer, I did not close myself off to grief, but I sat in it. I slept late. I let my body sleep until I was ready to wake up. Thankfully, I had an amazing boss who just let me come into work when I needed to. I kept a lot of silence. I spent a lot of time remembering, journaling, crying, and praying. I gave up drinking, foregoing my usual festive summer cocktails because I knew that drinking would just numb me from my sadness. And in order to find the God who seemed absent, I would need to take on the age-old biblical practice of lament, to cry out to God and to listen for God's answer. Losing my brother filled me with spiritual questions. They swarmed in me, made me very anxious, especially the summer after his death, and very agitated. I remember in the evenings, I would be ready to go to sleep, and then I would just clean my house for an hour and work something out, but I didn't quite know what it was that was agitating me in that way. I was annoyed by the trite Christian answers that people gave me and the well-meaning prayers. But sitting with my grief over several months enabled me finally to articulate the spiritual question that was deepest within me. And it was a question about life after death. If my brother had rejected God while he lived, would God nevertheless embrace him mercifully in his death? Where was my brother? Was he with God forever? In this loss, I didn't find joy in the visual beauty or moral beauty around me the way that I had when my dad died, but over time, my spiritual vision was refined, and the deep beauty of God's mercy came into view. Any vague beliefs that I had held about heaven and hell, about who is saved and unsaved, who is in and out, were challenged and clarified as I wondered about my brother's life after death. Through reading and counsel and prayer and plain primal instinct, I came to believe that there is no place vacant of God's love, that God pursues us fiercely like a mother for her lost child, and that in death, when the fog of hurt and sin and loneliness fade away, our vision of God will be so captivating, and all of us, my brother included, will worship with unending joy. Oscar Romero said, "There are some things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried." I see now that heaven is fuller than I imagined, and God more benevolent. And that is a source of profound, hard-earned joy. God knows about hard-earned joy. It was for joy that God's Son came into the world among us in Jesus, suffering the daily discomforts and tragic injustices of life in a human body. Hebrews 12:2 tells us that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The psalmist writes, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence, God, there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Jesus moved through suffering into the deep pleasures of God's presence and invites us to do the same. Grief can make us bitter, brittle people if we do not open ourselves to the heart of God in which grief and joy dwell together. But I believe that if we allow God to be with us in our grief and through suffering, we might be softened. We might become, as a favorite old book of mine says, real. Some of you who have young children may be more freshly familiar with the Velveteen Rabbit. And I want to read this passage. I'll show you the picture in case it sparks any nostalgia for you. The skin horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hairs in his tail had been pulled out to string bead necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away, and he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced, like the skin horse, understand all about it. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day when they were lying side by side near the nursery counter. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside of you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you're made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked, or bit by bit. "It doesn't happen all at once," said the skin horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been lopped off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. I suppose you are real, said the rabbit, and then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the Skin Horse might be sensitive. But the Skin Horse only smiled. When we open ourselves to God's presence with us in our suffering, we open ourselves to the love that makes us real. I hope that at the end of my life, I can say that I resemble one of those worn toys in the nursery. Grief and joy are always with us if we have the eyes to see them. And when we open our eyes to both, we might find ourselves in God's loving embrace. So years have passed since I lost Dad and Joe. I've given birth to 2 sons. I now focus on infant faces and the rhythms of life's beginning. I grieve now that I do not sleep through the night. Otherwise, there's a lot of joy in this season. And I hope it's a long while before I find myself again at grief's center. It is good to revel in joy, especially when we've worked our way prayerfully through whatever grief has been with us. When I find myself in a season of joy, I embrace it. And I hope that you can too. How about you? What are you grieving right now? What are you celebrating? Maybe there is some significant loss in your life, a recent death, a death from years ago that still chokes you up now and then, the end of a friendship, the end of a marriage, the loss of a person who you used to be. Maybe, mercifully, your life is untouched by significant hardship. But maybe a call to you is to open yourselves to others who grieve. Maybe your best friend's husband is ill, or you're being called to give some attention to someone in the city of Philadelphia or somewhere around the world and their grief. Has grief made it hard for you to notice and embrace joy? Has your desire to keep things as easy as possible kept you from honestly facing some grief within you or opening yourself up to the grief of those around you? And what are you celebrating? New love? Strong, weathered love? The friendship with your grown children? The beauty of cherry blossom and daffodils this week? In the bags that we gave you when you arrived, there is a journal and a pen. And I want to invite you over the next several minutes. We'll take about 10 minutes. And I just want to invite you to journal about the things that you are grieving and celebrating right now. And I also want you to take some notes about what is one word or idea that will stick with you from tonight. After we've taken about 10 minutes to meditate on these questions, I'll invite you to reconvene with your table. Or if you have a particularly dear friend who's across the room and you'd like to talk to that person, grab them. Or if you'd like some time to continue just being alone and reflecting, the sanctuary is open for silent reflection all throughout our weekend together. But when we gather in those groups, I invite you to share the answers to these questions. What are you celebrating and what are you grieving? What is something that's going to stay with you? And then to pray together with the women at your table. So I'll send you off now to journal, and then I'll let you know when it's time to gather as groups. Thank you, everyone.